Hugo's favorite game is Luminous History, a massively popular dating action RPG set at the Royal Luminous Academy. The game features hundreds of characters, each with unique story routes, favorability systems, and countless possible endings. Despite the freedom players enjoy, one character always causes trouble: Hugo Clay, the eldest son of the famous Clay Knight family. In every route, he becomes an obstacle, attempts to forcefully claim the main heroine, and is ultimately defeated by the protagonist. Now, that same Hugo Clay lies unconscious in a forest near the academy, wondering how he ended up there. To understand what happened, the story returns to the beginning. Before all this, a boy named Kure Hugo was spending his day watching his favorite hero TV show when his mother reminded him about his plans. Realizing he was late, he rushed out of the house. Hugo was an ordinary high school student, except for one thing: his deep admiration for heroes. His passion became obvious when he stopped to admire a newly released poster for his favorite movie. Suddenly, terrified screams filled the streets. A knife-wielding attacker was targeting random civilians. During the chaos, a young boy stumbled and fell directly into danger. Without hesitation, Hugo charged forward, fought off the attacker, and saved the child. However, he was stabbed during the struggle and collapsed. As darkness overtook him, Hugo saw the boy crying beside him. Believing he had failed to become the hero he always dreamed of being, he made one final wish: that in his next life, he would become a true hero capable of saving everyone. Moments later, Hugo opened his eyes and found a white-haired young man pointing a sword at him. Declaring victory, the boy introduced himself as Xenon and announced that he would now take Claire, just as promised. Completely confused, Hugo struggled to understand anything happening around him. When Claire arrived and questioned the situation, Xenon explained that he had defeated Hugo Clay, ended their engagement, and would protect her from now on. As Claire thanked him sincerely, Hugo lost consciousness again. After waking once more in an unfamiliar infirmary, Hugo discovered that his reflection and his entire life had become someone else's. Before he could process the shock, an elderly servant entered, called him a disgrace to the Clay family, and mocked him for losing despite wielding the legendary sword Galendil against a complete nobody. As Hugo stared in confusion, the old man continued criticizing him, saying he had tolerated Hugo's behavior because of his talent. But someone who repeatedly disgraced the Clay family was no longer needed. Hugo finally interrupted and demanded to know who the man was. The question angered the man further. Deciding there was nothing left to say, he announced that Hugo would be expelled from the dormitory and must return the sacred sword, Galendil. When Hugo tried to stop him, the man ordered him never to use the Clay name again before walking away. Afterward, Hugo assumed the man was supposed to be his father. However, he looked nothing like the father Hugo remembered. His foreign appearance only deepened Hugo's confusion. Soon, another boy entered and called him brother. Relieved that Hugo had awakened, he asked whether he was all right after their father's angry visit. Hugo was shocked because the boy resembled the child he had saved before dying. Ignoring that for now, Hugo asked who he was. The boy, surprised, wondered if Hugo had lost his memory after the duel. Hugo admitted that might be true and asked again. The boy introduced himself as Flay Clay, Hugo's younger half-brother. He explained that Hugo Clay was the eldest son of the prestigious Clay Knight family and the heir to the legendary sword, Galendil. Flay also revealed that his weak body prevented him from becoming a knight. He then explained that Hugo had lost a duel against a classmate. Worse, his fiancée, Claire, had been taken because of a bet. Their father now considered him a disgrace. Before Flay could continue, Hugo concluded that he had been reincarnated into another world. Although it was his first experience with reincarnation, he accepted the situation. Later that night, Hugo found himself sleeping in a forest near Luminous Academy, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. The academy was a prestigious school where future magic knights studied and lived in luxurious dormitories. Yet Hugo had been thrown out. From everything Flay explained, Hugo realized he had reincarnated into another world as someone sharing his name. However, this Hugo was completely different. Students celebrated his expulsion, claimed he deserved it, and even wished for his death. Hearing all this, Hugo concluded that the previous Hugo had abused both his family's influence and the sacred sword's power, doing whatever he wanted without caring about others. Hugo ignored everything else, but the freezing weather and hunger were unbearable. While wishing someone would help him, he suddenly saw Flay approaching. Flay was relieved to find him and revealed that he had brought food. Surprised and grateful, Hugo thanked him. Later, while eating on a bench, Hugo could not stop praising the food. Watching him eat so desperately, Flay realized how badly he had been starving. He apologized for arriving late. Hugo reassured him, insisting that bringing food was already more than enough. His sincere gratitude surprised Flay. Flay then asked whether Hugo's memories had returned. He admitted that their father's decision to disown Hugo seemed cruel. Hugo tried to defend their father, suggesting he might have had his reasons. Flay then revealed that he planned to convince their father to remove Hugo's punishment. Although grateful, Hugo doubted that would work. Even if their father changed his mind, everyone else still hated him. Hugo decided it would be better to start over. Although he still did not understand why he had been reincarnated, he accepted this reality. Soon after, Flay handed Hugo a bracelet-like device. Curious, Hugo asked what it was, but Flay simply told him to wear it. After Hugo put it on, Flay instructed him to pour magic into it. Caught off guard, Hugo tried to remain calm despite never knowing magic existed. As Flay watched excitedly, Hugo realized that pretending to have memory loss had limits. Even if he explained the truth, Flay would probably think he had gone crazy. Pushing aside his worries, Hugo concentrated on the bracelet despite having no idea what to do. Suddenly, it began glowing. Moments later, he found himself wearing an armored suit resembling something he had always admired. Thrilled, Hugo immediately struck dramatic poses and asked what had happened. Flay, however, was only relieved that the blaster had adjusted correctly. Hugo then learned that the armor was called a blaster. Flay explained that it was an enchanted full-body magical tool that expanded when infused with magic. By channeling energy through crystals embedded throughout the armor, the user could unleash powerful punches and kicks. Excited, Hugo asked whether that meant he could perform special attacks. Flay confirmed it but explained that the blaster was outdated and could not compare to the sacred equipment Hugo once used. Ignoring that detail, Hugo sincerely thanked Flay for giving him something so amazing. Surprised, Flay asked whether Hugo was really satisfied with such an outdated magic tool after once wielding a sacred sword with ease. Hugo, however, had a completely different perspective. To him, this was the transformation device he had always dreamed of owning. He immediately tried deactivating the armor and then summoned it again. Watching the suit appear once more filled him with excitement. Overjoyed, he thanked Flay repeatedly and even lifted him into the air. Embarrassed, Flay quickly told him to put him down. Hugo continued expressing his gratitude, saying that Flay had helped him countless times already. Flay was stunned that something so simple could make Hugo this happy. Hugo explained that being treated kindly was enough to make him grateful, and having a younger brother like Flay made him feel like the happiest older brother in the world. Hearing those words, Flay became deeply emotional. As night grew later, Flay said goodbye and promised to see him the next day. Now possessing the blaster, Hugo became convinced that he might finally achieve his dream of becoming a hero who could make everyone smile. Unable to contain his excitement, he immediately began training. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the academy, Xenon wore a disturbing smile, believing he had successfully saved Claire from Hugo. However, the truth was that this was not the real Xenon. His actual identity was Hanoid, another reincarnator from a different world. After dying in an accident, he and several others had been chosen by a god and reincarnated into the world of their favorite game, Luminous History, with Hanoid becoming Xenon Ash. Luminous History was a dating action RPG set in the Royal Luminous Academy, where players formed relationships, overcame challenges, and shaped their own stories. Hanoid's favorite character had always been Claire Rouge. According to the original storyline, Hugo would force himself on Claire during the prologue. To prevent that event, Hanoid, as Xenon, intervened and rescued her. He also remembered Hugo's future. After losing everything, Hugo would listen to demonic whispers, sacrifice his younger brother for power, and eventually die at the protagonist's hands. To Hanoid, that outcome was perfectly deserved. Still, he suspected the other reincarnators would soon begin acting as well. Nevertheless, Hanoid believed he alone would become the hero of this world and enjoy its rewards. The next morning, Hugo arrived at the academy only to be challenged to a duel by a student named Marcos Bog. Even after hearing about Hugo's memory loss, Marcos insisted on fighting, leaving Hugo completely stunned. Confused, Hugo asked Marcos whether he had done something terrible in the past to deserve such hostility. Marcos admitted that Hugo had never personally wronged him, but he had disliked him for a long time. Now that Hugo had lost both his memories and his sacred sword, Marcos believed it was the perfect chance to crush him completely. He proudly declared that he would force Hugo to grovel on the ground and make sure he never recovered from the humiliation. Hearing this, Hugo was left speechless. He could not help asking whether anyone had ever told Marcos that he had an awful personality. Marcos seemed like the type of person who openly voiced every unpleasant thought he had. This only made Hugo wonder what kind of person the previous Hugo had been to earn such hatred. Deciding not to dwell on it, Hugo apologized again and tried to leave, explaining that someone was waiting for him. However, Marcos stopped him and casually asked whether he meant his younger brother. Confused, Hugo turned around just as another student approached Marcos and proudly announced that they had brought Hugo's brother. Looking over, Hugo saw Flay being dragged forward by two students. Marcos praised their efforts and stated that they had made negotiations much easier. Shocked, Hugo demanded to know what was happening. Marcos calmly explained that he had brought Flay to ensure Hugo accepted the duel. If Hugo refused, then his younger brother would take his place. The threat instantly angered Hugo. Flay tried reassuring him by saying the boys were not particularly strong, but one of the students suddenly squeezed his hand hard enough to make him cry out in pain. Alarmed, Hugo ordered them to stop immediately. Marcos smirked and told Hugo that he already knew what he had to do. If he wished to avoid watching his brother suffer, then he should accept the challenge. Having no other choice, Hugo agreed, but with one condition: Flay had to be released first. Marcos accepted and ordered his followers to let him go. Afterward, Flay apologized repeatedly, but Hugo assured him that none of this was his fault. Surprised, Marcos remarked that he never expected someone as evil as Hugo to care about family. Hugo immediately responded that he was equally shocked someone as disgusting as Marcos attended the academy. Marcos then proposed their wager. If he won, Hugo would grovel and lick his shoes. Hugo accepted and declared that if he won, Marcos would disappear from his sight forever. As the duel began, spectators gathered, eager to witness Hugo's defeat once again. In response, Hugo bluntly stated that if this was Marcos's magic tool, then his taste was absolutely terrible. Offended, Marcos proudly declared that this weapon was the treasured heirloom of the Bulg family, the legendary Giga Scissors. Hearing that name, Hugo experienced a painful sense of secondhand embarrassment. Despite its dramatic title, the weapon was literally just an enormous pair of scissors. Putting that aside, Hugo noticed that the weapon functioned similarly to the blaster Flay had given him. He immediately activated his own magic tool and transformed into his armored form. The moment Marcos saw the outdated armor, he burst into laughter. The surrounding students joined in, cheering for Marcos and loudly expressing their hatred for Hugo, while urging Marcos to crush him. Looking around, Hugo asked whether the duel had already started. Marcos confirmed that the match had begun the instant they both activated their magic tools. Accepting that, Hugo suggested they begin properly. Marcos assumed Hugo was preparing for close combat. Instead, Hugo started repeating the strange movements he had practiced the previous night. Watching this bizarre display, Marcos became increasingly confused before mocking Hugo again, calling him a clown. Ignoring the insults, Hugo continued concentrating. Once he had gathered enough power, he unleashed his attack. The resulting explosion kicked up a massive cloud of dust, leaving everyone watching in stunned silence. Meanwhile, Hugo felt relieved that his experiment had succeeded. His late-night training sessions, inspired by the heroes from his previous world, had paid off. Proud of his accomplishment, he decided to name the technique Dragon Fang Blaster. Even so, Hugo understood that the attack had only worked because Marcos had lowered his guard. In a real battle, an enemy could easily interrupt his preparation. He resolved to improve the technique later. For now, however, he prepared for Marcos's counterattack. To his surprise, Marcos remained completely motionless, staring blankly at the battlefield in disbelief. Not only Hugo but also Flay and the other students were stunned. Hugo turned to Flay and asked whether he had actually won. Still shocked, Flay confirmed that Marcos had indeed been defeated. Hugo concluded that special moves were supposed to end fights dramatically anyway. Flay quickly insisted that this was not the important issue and suggested they leave immediately. Later, Hugo apologized for dragging Flay into danger and causing them to miss lunch. However, Flay only looked at him with admiration. He was amazed that Hugo had mastered the blaster so quickly and had even fired a magic projectile during his first battle. Hugo finally began to understand the situation. He asked Flay whether creating a modern full-body armor using lightweight and durable materials would solve the problem. Flay explained that manufacturing even a single suit required enormous resources, time, and effort. The cost alone made large-scale production unrealistic. More importantly, convenience was the deciding factor. Although the blaster could channel magic throughout the user's entire body, it offered no additional abilities. Since most magic knights used separate magic weapons for combat, wearing heavy armor simply became unnecessary. Hearing this, Hugo felt devastated. He thanked Flay anyway, realizing he had just learned a harsh truth. In a world where people possessed incredible abilities on their own, practicality mattered far more than style. No matter how cool transforming heroes looked, efficiency would always come first. Seeing Hugo's disappointment, Flay quickly tried to reassure him. He explained that full-body armor magic tools had not disappeared completely. Some still survived as treasured heirlooms passed down through noble families. Hearing this, Hugo remembered that Marcos had also described his giant scissors as a family heirloom. More importantly, however, Hugo realized that almost everyone around him hated him except for one person. Curious, he asked Flay why he treated him so kindly despite his terrible reputation. Flay was surprised by the question. Smiling warmly, he explained that Hugo had once been his greatest benefactor. Although Hugo no longer remembered it, he had been the only person in their household who had ever shown Flay genuine kindness. As an illegitimate child born with a weak body and no talent for becoming a magic knight, Flay had grown up isolated and neglected. Even he had begun believing he was worthless. At his lowest point, Hugo had encouraged him, saying that even if he lacked talent as a knight, he possessed talent as a researcher. Hugo had even promised that once he became head of the Clay family, he would make Flay his right-hand man. For the first time, someone had truly acknowledged him. Because of that promise, Flay worked harder than ever and eventually entered Luminous Academy. Without Hugo, he believed he would have remained trapped in loneliness forever. Hearing this story, Hugo was deeply shocked. Flay then added that Hugo had always kept his promises and would continue winning no matter what anyone else said. Determined not to disappoint him, Hugo vowed to become the kind of older brother Flay could proudly admire. When Flay called him a hero, Hugo was left speechless and silently promised to protect that smile no matter what. Xenon remembered that Marcos Bulg was originally an early recruitable character who later became irrelevant as the story progressed. Although Marcos hated Hugo, he never challenged him because he feared Gallandil. Instead, he targeted the protagonist, whom he considered weaker, triggering a duel event. After losing, Marcos joined the protagonist's party and matured through their rivalry. Realizing this, Xenon understood that Marcos had only challenged Hugo because Gallandil had been confiscated after Hugo's defeat. His own interference had changed the original storyline, and the consequences could be serious. Fortunately, no other reincarnator seemed interested in Marcos. If a more popular character had been involved, Xenon would have faced real trouble. Thinking about popularity reminded him of another heroine whose popularity rivaled Claire's. Feeling only slightly guilty, he decided to pursue her next and continue building his ideal harem. Meanwhile, Hugo and Flay arrived at the academy cafeteria. Hugo was amazed by its luxurious appearance. Suddenly, another student mocked him, saying that since he had been disowned, he was no longer Hugo Clay. The student even asked whether Hugo had enough money to eat. Others mocked Hugo for living off his younger brother. To their surprise, Hugo openly admitted that it was embarrassing. Realizing he needed income, he decided to find work. When he asked about available jobs, a female student approached and asked if he was serious. After Hugo confirmed it, she suggested they work together. She introduced herself as Melt Epi, a transfer student. Hugo introduced himself as Hugo Clay, although he admitted he was unsure whether he could still use that name. Melt already knew about his situation. After confirming that Hugo had been disowned following his duel, Melt explained that she knew of a quest requiring 2 people. When Hugo mentioned his memory loss, she explained that quests were jobs requested by local residents to help students develop responsibility as future magic knights. Students received payment after completing them, and some even covered their living expenses this way. Hearing this, Hugo realized that Melt also needed money. The system reminded him of part-time jobs from his previous world. Curious, he asked what kind of quest she wanted to take. The similarity surprised Hugo. Even in another world, students still searched for work opportunities and worried about money. Pushing that thought aside, he focused on Melt's proposal and waited for her explanation. His curiosity only continued growing rapidly. Melt pulled out a sheet of paper and handed it to Hugo. After reading it, he discovered that the quest involved patrolling a nearby road. Once Hugo understood the assignment, Melt asked whether the reward looked worthwhile. Since Hugo knew absolutely nothing about the economy of this world, he could not give a proper answer. However, because he needed money to survive, he decided to accept the job. Melt immediately became excited and admitted that the quest deadline was today. She had nearly given up on finding a partner. As Hugo awkwardly pointed out that she was standing a little too close, Flay suddenly returned carrying meal tickets. Looking at Melt, he asked Hugo who she was. Before Hugo could answer, Melt cheerfully introduced herself as Hugo's friend. After hearing that, Flay turned toward Hugo for confirmation. The moment Hugo nodded, tears started forming in Flay's eyes. Overwhelmed with happiness, Flay confessed that he never imagined Hugo would make a friend so quickly. He was so happy that it felt unreal. Hearing that, Hugo felt strangely hurt and asked whether Flay was making fun of him. Watching their interaction, Melt commented that Flay clearly cared deeply about his brother. She also admitted that Hugo seemed completely different from the rumors she had heard. Embarrassed, Hugo explained that losing his memories had probably changed him. Melt disagreed with the Academy's opinion of him. She argued that someone truly evil would never have earned such affection from his younger brother. Because of that, she believed Hugo was not nearly as terrible as everyone claimed. She then added that she was happy Hugo had become her first friend at the Academy. Hearing this, Hugo realized that Melt was an incredibly kind person. In fact, if she had existed in the hero shows from his previous world, she would definitely have been one of the main characters. More importantly, Hugo felt that making his first friend since reincarnating marked the true beginning of his new life. The following day, Hugo and Melt arrived at their quest location. Seeing a steam train traveling across the tracks, Hugo felt as though he had stepped directly into an anime world. Melt explained that it was actually a magic train. She admitted that she had never seen one herself before coming here. Surprised, Hugo asked whether trains were uncommon. Melt explained that she came from a rural area where people relied on horse-drawn carriages, while trains mostly operated near the capital. She promised that they would ride one together someday. Hugo smiled and admitted that losing his memories suddenly did not seem so bad. After speaking with the station staff, Melt explained that the train they had seen earlier still had not arrived. Hugo suspected something had happened inside the tunnel and agreed when Melt suggested investigating. Once inside, Hugo was shocked by how dark it was. He could not even see the exit. Melt explained that the tunnel's curve blocked the outside light. While talking, she lost her footing and nearly fell. Although she recovered quickly, Hugo accidentally caught a brief glimpse of something. Embarrassed, Melt asked whether he had seen anything. Hugo, having noticed only a flash of purple, denied seeing anything and blamed the darkness. Still doubtful, she questioned him again, but he reassured her and warned her to walk carefully. Hugo then asked whether they had a light source. Melt raised her hand and summoned a glowing blade-shaped object. She warned him to touch only the handle and explained that it was her magic tool, the sword ring. She then demonstrated how she could shape magic into light. However, something else caught Hugo's attention. Melt was a beautiful girl from a distant region, wore purple, was clumsy, and could create swords of light. The similarities to a certain character from his memories were unsettling. When Melt asked why he had gone silent, Hugo quickly recovered. Now that they had light, she suggested continuing the search. Hugo volunteered to walk ahead. Eventually, they found the train. However, Hugo immediately realized that something was wrong. There were no sounds coming from inside. Melt wondered whether the passengers and crew had abandoned the train. Hugo decided to enter first. After opening the door and announcing himself, Hugo was greeted by silence. As Melt approached, she slipped again. Hugo pointed out that this was already the second time. Melt insisted that the floor itself was slippery. At that moment, a familiar voice laughed, commenting that Hugo had found himself a clumsy partner. Standing before them was Marcos. He remarked that Hugo and his companion made a fitting pair. Hugo responded by calling him the Crab Noble, which immediately irritated Marcos. Correcting him, Marcos introduced himself as Marcos Bulgaria. Marcos admitted that he never expected Hugo to be guarding this side of the tunnel. Even more surprising was the fact that a girl had willingly partnered with Hugo. After watching Melt stumble repeatedly, however, he dismissed her as nothing more than a clumsy country girl. Melt immediately fired back, asking why a proud noble like Marcos was taking such a low-paying quest. Before he could answer, she bluntly asked if he was having financial problems. Caught off guard, Marcos denied it at first. However, he eventually admitted that after losing his duel, his parents had cut off his allowance. Although he tried to act like it did not bother him, Melt could not help laughing, feeling that justice had been served. Hugo quickly stopped their argument, pointing out that this was not the time for personal disputes. He then asked Marcos whether he had found anyone while searching from the opposite side of the tunnel. Marcos replied that he had not seen a single person. Judging from their expressions, he realized they had found nothing either. The conclusion was terrifying. Everyone aboard the train had simply vanished. As Melt struggled to process the situation, Hugo wondered whether people could truly disappear without a trace. Marcos explained that one of his followers was already investigating the train and suggested waiting for more information. Hugo was about to insist that they report the incident immediately when he suddenly heard something. Noticing his reaction, Melt asked what was wrong. Hugo replied that he had heard a child's voice nearby. Since neither Melt nor Marcos had heard anything, Marcos dismissed it as imagination. Hugo, however, remained certain. Without hesitation, he rushed out of the train, with Melt chasing after him. Eventually, Hugo stopped at the spot where he had heard the voice. Despite Melt warning him not to act recklessly, they discovered a young girl lying unconscious beneath the train. Relieved to see that she was alive, Hugo checked on her while Melt praised his extraordinary hearing. Moments later, the girl opened her eyes. The instant she saw Hugo, she recoiled in fear. Trying to calm her, Hugo gently explained that he was there to help. The girl hesitantly asked whether he had really come to save her. Hugo assured her that he had. After introducing himself, Hugo explained that they had come to investigate the stopped train. The mention of the train, the girl began trembling and mentioned her mother. When Hugo carefully asked what had happened, she revealed that a magic beast had taken everyone. The revelation shocked Hugo, while Melt immediately became serious. Believing the train was safer, Melt suggested continuing the conversation there. After returning, she called Hugo over and showed him something she had discovered. It was a thick, sticky thread attached to the girl's clothing. Although uncertain, Melt believed it was spider silk produced not by an ordinary creature, but by a terrifying magic beast. Melt nodded, confirming Hugo's suspicion. Although Hugo expected monsters to exist in a world filled with magic, he never imagined encountering creatures resembling the villains from his favorite hero shows. At that moment, Marcos confirmed that they were indeed dealing with a magic beast. Based on the evidence collected by his subordinate, he concluded that goblins possessing the abilities of giant spiders were responsible. Curious, Hugo asked how he had reached that conclusion. Marcos explained that no single monster could capture an entire train full of passengers alone. Therefore, the attackers had to be operating as a group. Since goblins were the only monsters in the area known for coordinated attacks, they were the most likely culprits. He theorized that the goblins had hidden within the tunnel, prepared traps, ambushed the train, and kidnapped everyone aboard. Marcos then added that the captives were probably being kept alive as supplies and breeding hosts. According to his estimate, the victims were already being transported to the monster's nest, where terrible things would soon happen. Before he could continue, Hugo immediately stopped him. He reminded Marcos that Mina's mother was among the missing, and that such a conversation should never happen in front of a frightened child. Realizing his mistake, Marcos apologized and admitted that he had spoken carelessly. Understanding the seriousness of the situation, Melt insisted that they had to rescue the passengers. However, Marcos argued that there was no way to track the monsters because the spider silk traces were spread throughout the entire train. As Melt tried to object, Hugo suddenly interrupted. Sitting down near the area where Melt had fallen, he asked whether this was exactly where she had slipped. After she confirmed it, Hugo examined the ground and discovered a strange liquid. Rubbing it between his fingers, he realized it was neither water nor blood. Instead, it was oil. He explained that certain spider species produced oil to prevent their silk from sticking to their own bodies. Since Melt had mentioned that the floor felt slippery, he decided to investigate. Melt was secretly pleased that her clumsiness had contributed to the discovery. Hugo then proposed following the oil trail while someone escorted Mina out of the tunnel and informed the station. Although Marcos disliked following Hugo's orders, he reluctantly agreed because Hugo had found the clue. Following the trail, the group eventually reached the monster's nest. There, they found the missing passengers guarded by ordinary goblins. Then, a massive goblin spider hybrid emerged from the cave, leaving Hugo both horrified and fascinated by the terrifying creature. Marcos's explanation of the monster's name barely registered with Hugo because he suddenly realized that Marcos had disappeared. Marcos was already walking toward the magic beast. Calling it a disgusting creature, he boldly introduced himself and announced that he would personally cut off its head. Hugo was stunned. He had planned to rescue the passengers quietly, but Marcos had destroyed any chance of a stealth operation. Realizing they had no alternative, Hugo told Melt that while Marcos distracted the enemy, they needed to free the captives quickly. Melt agreed. The two rushed to the prisoners and tried calming them while Hugo began cutting the spider threads. However, he quickly discovered that the threads were far tougher than expected. At this rate, rescuing everyone would take too long. More importantly, Hugo realized that the threads could only be destroyed using magic. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed throughout the cave. Hugo turned and saw Marcos flying into a wall while angrily calling the monster a coward. Watching closely, Hugo noticed that the creature had wrapped spider silk around Marcos's giant scissors, rendering his weapon useless. The realization shocked him. This monster understood its opponent's weaknesses. Hugo realized that the true danger of the Arak was not its claws or webs, but its intelligence inherited from goblins. At that moment, he noticed another problem. There were only 3 Arak present, despite the number of kidnapped passengers. Before he could think further, one of the monsters fired a thread toward him. As Melt called out in alarm, 2 other Arak captured her and restrained her movements. Terrified, Melt struggled while the creatures approached her. Without hesitation, Hugo broke free, activated the blaster, and pulled Melt away from danger. Gathering his strength, he launched himself at one of the monsters and destroyed it with a single strike. When another Arak attacked, Hugo unleashed a second technique, which he dramatically named Blaster Dynamic Slash, sending the creature flying. Everyone stared at him in shock, especially because he announced the attack's name afterward. Ignoring their reactions, Hugo asked Melt to handle the remaining passengers while he assisted Marcos. He rushed over and told Marcos to use Melt's sword ring to free his weapon. However, Marcos was too stunned by Hugo's strength to listen. Refusing help, he insisted he could continue fighting alone. Before Hugo could argue further, the monster kicked Marcos directly into a wall once again. And that's where this incredible chapter leaves us. Hugo has finally found people who believe in him, but now he faces his greatest challenge yet against a terrifying enemy far beyond anything he expected. Will he be able to save everyone and prove that he can truly become the hero he always dreamed of being? We'll have to wait and see. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of this amazing story.